The line of John Barker's wife, Arzelia Rose, can be traced with confidence back to her great-grandfather, John David "Dad" Rose, born 1761 in the vicinity of Berkeley Springs, Virginia. DNA tests of descendants indicate our Rose haplogroup matches that of several Rose descendants from England. John married Rebecca Bowen in about 1780, and they lived for a while in Harrison County, Virginia, now West Virginia, then moved to Fayette County, Pennsylvania, before ending their journey in what is now Breathitt County, Kentucky, where they bought more than 1,300 acres of land on the North Fork of the Kentucky River in 1803, a year before Lewis and Clark began exploring the Louisiana Purchase that had nearly doubled the size of the U.S., and nearly 20 years before our first Barker ancestors settled in Kentucky. Having entered Kentucky that early, when Native American tribes such as the Chickasaw, Cherokee, Yuchi, and the much-feared Shawnee were plentiful, and some still resisting the invasion of whites, it is probable that John and Rebecca had encounters with them of one kind or another. John bought and sold land over the next 20 years. He and Rebecca are buried in one of the oldest graveyards in eastern Kentucky at Lexie in Wolfe County, on the farm of their grandson, Joseph Powell Rose. When they had entered Kentucky, John and Rebecca had 2 daughters and 7 sons, one of whom was Arzelia Rose's grandfather, John Rose Jr., who sometimes appeared in the records as John Jackson or Jackie Rose. John married Mary Ann Polly Morrow and settled in the Stillwater Valley in about 1818, along with 2 brothers, David and Israel. Before long, the 3 brothers had bought up most of the rich valley and surrounding hills, much of it from famous Kentucky pioneer, land speculator, and statesman Henry Clay. A deed shows that John Rose Jr. purchased 300 acres of land bordering some of David's land for $100 in 1828 from Clay. Between 1838 and 1840, John built an impressive 2-story log house just down the hill from his existing log home. In the same year, he became Justice of the Peace and appears in the records as John Rose, Esquire. The Rose boys learned from Clay as well as from their father, buying and selling land at a prodigious rate, with their names appearing repeatedly on land grant records. Some of David's land stretched all the way to the scenic Red River Gorge, now part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. In 1848, John and Polly divided their considerable land holdings among their children. The log farmhouse and surrounding land was inherited by Jefferson Morrow Rose and was one of the oldest houses still standing in Wolfe County in the early 1960s. The house had been covered by white weatherboard siding in the early 1900s. Sometime in the 60s, the house was disassembled and taken to the Wolfe County seat of Campton with the intention of turning it into a museum. The project was never completed, and the logs decayed on an open lot in town. Today, a modern brick home stands on the site of John and Polly's home, although their gravestones have not been identified due to significant erosion of the engravings. They are believed to be buried in what is now the Rose Buchanan Cemetery on the hill just west of their house. Their oldest son, and the father of Arzelia Rose, was William Bowen Rose. He was born in 1814. He married Nancy Williams in 1840. She was the granddaughter of one of the early pioneers in the Big Sandy Valley of Kentucky, Daniel Williams, who arrived at Daniel Boone's early settlement, Fort Boonesboro, in 1779 at age 13. He met his future wife, Violet Crouch, there, and both were no doubt acquaintances of the famous Boone. Nancy's father, Isaac, was born there in 1798. Daniel and Violet settled on Caney Creek in Morgan County, Kentucky, and built this house. Though he lived only to age 57, it has been estimated that Daniel Williams, who used to preach under this massive oak tree, and Violet have more than 100,000 descendants, including the author of this video standing under the tree, and many of you watching it. Within 5 years, William B. Rose and Nancy had purchased or perhaps inherited 261 acres of land from his parents in the Stillwater Valley. William built the first grist mill on Stillwater Creek below the bridge. Arzelia would be the youngest of their 9 children, and she would marry John C. Barker, both being the subject of the previous video, part 16. The involvement, if any, of the Rose clan in the Civil War is unclear, but they weren't immune to the violence, as William's parents' log home on the hill was damaged by a cannonball during the war, but the reason is unknown. In addition, they were vulnerable to soldiers on both sides, as well as home guards and other irregular bands of men who looted area farms of food and livestock. The Roses used these limestone overhangs to hide their food and valuables. One of Arzelia's older sisters saved her prized riding horse from being taken by two soldiers by appealing to their better instincts to treat a young woman fairly. William and Nancy are buried in the Rose Buchanan Cemetery, where William's parents are believed to be buried. Most of William and Nancy Rose's children remained in the area, but like many families who sought a better life or at least cheap land, two of their daughters moved with their husbands and children to the Indian territories of Oklahoma. First to leave sometime in the 1890s was Polly E. Rose and her husband William F. Elkins. In 1900, she was followed by her oldest sister, Mary Elizabeth, who had married Milburn Linkus. Milburn died 4 years after their arrival, but Mary stayed on with the kids. She died in 1928 at age 87 and is buried in Sand Springs, Oklahoma. Polly died a year earlier than her older sister at age 72, and she and William's combined marker is in Stonewall, Oklahoma. It would be interesting to know how closely Polly and Elizabeth's children's lives paralleled that of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author of Little House on the Prairie. Census records show that they were farmers in a land that dared humans to cultivate it successfully. It would also be interesting to know if they ever lived in sod homes and what they did to survive. No doubt their lives were hard. Consider this. One of their neighbors took his family to the territories, but returned to Stillwater in 1899 with the bodies of his wife and 2 children for burial. He stayed for a few weeks and returned to Oklahoma, but not before taking his deceased wife's younger sister as his bride. Less than a year after their return, his new bride brought his body back to Stillwater. In March 1910, Reverend John Barker officiated the services for his niece, the daughter of Arzelia's brother, Judge Joseph Powell Rose. She had died of tuberculosis. 3 months later, Reverend Barker would officiate the funeral for his brother, Dudley, who died in the same TB epidemic. Another of William and Nancy's children was Arzelia's brother, Silas Hogg Rose. Silas married Loma Goodwin, and he lived out his 78 years in Wolfe County as a farmer and beekeeper. He was also the Stillwater postmaster and a miller at the Stillwater grist mill built by his dad. Another of Arzelia's brothers, Isaac W. Rose, was appointed county attorney for Morgan County, Kentucky. By far the most ambitious, prolific, connected, and well-known of Arzelia's siblings was John M. Rose. He married Elizabeth Lizzie Swango, the daughter of a prominent merchant in Hazel Green. John started out as a small general store owner and teacher in Stillwater, but soon took his experience and skills to larger Hazel Green. Over the next quarter century, John opened and closed several stores, made a small fortune buying and selling livestock, as well as bankruptcy and foreclosure properties. He bought and sold land as oil and gas exploration companies moved into the county. He dabbled in railroads, timber, and even contracted to deliver mail. His political ambitions were no less impressive, and he was elected county superintendent, town councilman, and president of the Building and Loan Association. He was elected judge and even ran for state representative. Finally, William and Nancy's daughter, Jillie Ann Rose Buchanan, the last living sibling of Arzelia Rose, died at Stillwater at age 80 in 1941. She is also buried in the Rose Buchanan Cemetery on the hill. It is an era that seems surreal when visiting some of these locations today. The entire Stillwater Valley has only a fraction of the population it did in its heyday. Likewise for Hazel Green and Grassy Creek. Incredibly, both Wolfe and Morgan County populations are 20% smaller today than they were a century ago. The elders died off as their descendants sought better lives in the Indian territories and later in the automobile and steel industries of the North. For nearly the whole of the 19th century and well into the 20th, the Rose clan owned contiguous land that stretched along most of the Stillwater Valley and beyond. Some of it is still owned by Roses 2 centuries after David, John, and Israel first settled there.